The wheat stood chest-high that August, golden and worthless. Magda Kress walked the center line she'd painted herself 3 years prior, white latex against cracked asphalt, measuring distances she'd measured 1,000 times. The bank's foreclosure notice sat folded in her shirt pocket, edges soft from handling. 63 acres of Montana grassland, one runway, one life. The airstrip designation had been N47, private use, agricultural, but the sectional charts showed it abandoned since spring. They were wrong. Every morning she walked it. Every evening she dragged the runway lights from the barn and positioned them in their coffee cans, solar-charged, waiting. For what she couldn't say anymore. The town called it grief. Her brother called it pathological. The VA therapist called it avoidance behavior, transitioning from military structure to civilian purposelessness. Magda called it Tuesday. She'd flown combat resupply in Afghanistan, 72 missions, C-130s loaded so heavy the stall warning screamed on takeoff. Call sign Shepherd. They'd given it to her after Helmand Province, after she'd brought a shot-up Hercules home with one engine and hydraulics leaking across 3 provinces. Brought everyone home. Always. The call sign stuck like a scar. But that was a different sky. This sky was empty. The airstrip was empty. The farmhouse her grandfather built stood empty except for her. She'd bought the property with her separation pay, some half-formed dream about growing something, about silence meaning peace instead of just absence. The wheat had grown. The silence had too. She noticed the contrail at 1900 hours, high and straight, too deliberate for commercial traffic. The sun hung low, painting everything amber. She shaded her eyes, watching. The contrail broke pattern, began a wide descending arc. Not toward Billings, not toward Great Falls, toward nothing, toward here. She felt something old and military kick alive in her chest, that pre-mission alertness, the quality of attention that had kept her alive when rockets punched through cargo bays at midnight. The C-5 Galaxy came in low over the eastern ridge just after 2100, landing lights blazing white against the dusk. Impossible. The runway was 4,200 feet, barely adequate for a Cessna 172. A C-5 needed 8,000 minimum, full emergency protocols, ground crew, precision. But it came anyway, massive and inevitable as weather, engines howling, revering thrust across her wheat field. The nose lifted slightly, wing flaps extended to configurations she recognized from muscle memory. Someone very good was flying. Someone who knew exactly what 4,200 feet meant and had calculated it down to the foot. The Galaxy's wheels touched her center line perfectly. Rubber screamed. The aircraft shuddered, braking systems groaning, and rolled to a stop 70 feet from her barn. Then the engine spooled down into silence. Magda stood in her own wheat, hand unconsciously touching the folded foreclosure notice, watching the cargo ramp begin its hydraulic descent. Dust hung golden in the landing lights. Somewhere inside her memory, a radio crackled with voices she'd tried to forget. The ramp settled onto asphalt with a metal-on-stone sound that echoed across the empty land. No markings on the fuselage, just gray paint and shadow. No radio calls, no warning. For 30 seconds, nothing moved. Then a figure appeared at the top of the ramp, silhouetted, and started down. Male, mid-50s, wearing a flight suit with no rank insignia, no name tape. He walked with the particular looseness of someone who just set down a million-pound aircraft on a runway that shouldn't exist. "Shepherd," he said, not a question. Magda's hand dropped from her pocket. "That airstrip's been decommissioned. 14 months. "I know." He stopped at the ramp's base, 10 feet away, studying her the way pilots study weather. "I'm Crowley. We flew over Kandahar, January 2012. You talked me through a hydraulic failure while taking small arms fire. I was flying a C-17, cargo was medical supplies and 60 Afghan kids being evacuated. You stayed on frequency for 40 minutes past your fuel reserve, talking me down." He paused. "You probably don't remember." She did, every voice, every call sign. The memory was instant and complete. "You made it." "Everyone made it." Crowley glanced back at the Galaxy. "Because of you, you stayed." "It was the job." "It was more." He gestured toward the aircraft. I need your help again. Different circumstances, same principle. People who need to get somewhere impossible. The cargo bay's interior lights flickered on, revealing shapes, movement, the suggestion of passengers. This is off book. No record, no paperwork, no official anything. Just me, a plane too big for this runway, and the only pilot I trust to understand what needs doing without asking questions that don't have good answers. Magda looked at the galaxy, then at her farmhouse, then at the wheat moving in the wind. I'm a civilian. I grow wheat that won't sell on land the bank's taking in 6 days. Your shepherd, that doesn't expire. Crowley pulled a tablet from his flight suit. I need ground coordination. Refueling setup, perimeter security, communications relay. 48 hours, maybe less. There are 16 people in that aircraft who have been flying for 19 hours through 7 countries' airspace that officially didn't see us. They need rest, resupply, and one more impossible thing. Which is someone who remembers what service means when the paperwork stops mattering. He extended the tablet. I'll pay, enough to clear your foreclosure and then some, but that's not why you'll say yes. She didn't take the tablet immediately. The wheat rustled. The galaxy's hull ticked as metal cooled. Behind Crowley, faces appeared in the cargo bay, exhausted, watching, hopeful in the way only people running towards something instead of away from it looked hopeful. Who are they? Engineers, doctors, interpreters who worked with coalition forces, people we promised safety to and then forgot about when the cameras left. Crowley's voice stayed level, professional, but something underneath it was urgent. The official channels closed. This is what's left. Networks of people who remember promises, flying routes that don't exist on any chart, landing at places civilian pilots maintain for reasons they probably can't explain to themselves. Magda took the tablet. The screen showed flight paths, waypoints, a network spanning 3 continents. Dozens of routes, all terminating at small airstrips, private fields, forgotten runways. Each one maintained by someone like her. Each one marked with a call sign from another life. How many? She asked. Stops, this is number 41. Shepard was always the tricky one. Shortest runway, most exposed, highest risk. He smiled slightly. But also the most reliable. I knew you'd have the lights ready. She had every night, for reasons that felt insane until this exact moment. What do you need first? The next 48 hours moved with the rhythm of missions Magda had thought were finished forever. The galaxy required fuel. She coordinated with a trucker she knew from her Air Force days. Cash transaction, no questions, diesel and JP-8 delivered in unmarked tanks before dawn. The passengers needed food. She emptied her pantry and called in favors from 3 neighbors who asked nothing beyond her promise that this mattered. It mattered. She set up a perimeter using motion sensors left over from her security system design, overlapping fields of coverage that would give 5 minutes warning of any approach. The Montana night was clear, stars thick overhead, the kind of sky she'd loved flying under before everything became complicated by endings and foreclosures and silence that meant the wrong things. The passengers emerged slowly, carefully, carrying exhaustion like physical weight. 2 doctors, Pakistani, who'd worked trauma surgery in Kabul's civilian hospitals and treated coalition forces despite threats. 4 engineers who designed water purification systems and were now targeted for collaboration. 7 interpreters and their families, children sleeping against parents' shoulders, too tired even for fear. 1 elderly woman who said nothing, just gripped Magda's hand and held it, eyes saying everything. They rested in her barn, on blankets she hadn't known she'd kept, and Magda found herself moving between them with water, with food, with the quiet competence she'd learned in cargo holds full of wounded soldiers who needed someone calm more than they needed words. This was familiar. This was the job she'd actually been good at, the part that had nothing to do with flying and everything to do with understanding what people needed when the world had reduced itself to survival and miles remaining. Crowley worked on the aircraft with 2 crew members who'd stayed silent throughout, running diagnostics, checking systems that had been pushed past their tolerances. Magda joined them as the sun rose, climbing into the galaxy's cockpit, a space she knew by heart even though she'd never flown one. The instrument panels glowed softly. Everything smelled like hydraulic fluid and coffee and long missions. YN-47, Crowley asked, adjusting a fuel mixture setting. Why here? Magda ran her hand along the throttle quadrant. My grandfather flew crop dusters, built the strip in 1967. I learned to fly here, Cessna 152, before I ever touched a military aircraft. When I got out, I thought. She stopped. I don't know what I thought, that I could come back to something simpler, that flying could mean something different. Does it? Tonight it does. She looked through the windscreen at her wheat, at the mountains beyond, at the impossible distance between who she'd been and who she was trying to become. I stopped maintaining this place because I thought I was holding onto the wrong things. But maybe the things that won't let us go are the things that know us better than we know ourselves. Crowley nodded slowly. Shepherd wasn't just about bringing people home. It was about refusing to leave anyone behind, even when command said the mission was over. You stayed on frequency when everyone else signed off. That's not a skill you forget. It's not even a skill. It's who you are. The words settled like weight, like recognition. Magda had spent 3 years trying to become someone who didn't carry that identity anymore. Someone who could grow wheat and ignore the sky and pretend that the silence meant peace. But Shepherd wasn't a call sign. It was a fact, immutable as her height or her hands or the way she couldn't walk past something broken without calculating how to fix it. What happens after here? She asked. 2 more stops, then safe houses in Canada, people who will help with paperwork that shouldn't be necessary but is. Then lives, the regular kind, boring and unglamorous and exactly what we promised them. Crowley powered down the diagnostic screen. And then I disappear this route. Burn the records, forget the waypoints, make sure no one can follow it back to the people who made it possible. Including me. Especially you. You've got a life to rebuild, a farm to save. Can't do that if government types show up asking questions about unauthorized landings and humanitarian smuggling. Magda smiled slightly. Is that what this is, smuggling? Technically, also rescue, also promises kept, depends who's asking. He stood, stretching, joints popping. But for you, officially, nothing happened. A plane didn't land. You're just a farmer with an airstrip you maintain out of stubbornness or sentiment or whatever reason keeps you walking that center line. She understood. Plausible deniability, operational security, the whole architecture of missions that existed in the gaps between official reality. She'd lived in those gaps for years. Maybe she'd never actually left. They refueled at dawn, pumping fuel while the mountains turned pink and gold. The passengers reboarded slowly, children carried by parents who moved with the careful deliberation of people afraid to believe they might actually be safe. The elderly woman found Magda before ascending the ramp, pressed something small and metal into her palm. A coin, Pakistani, old and worn smooth. No words, just that exchange, and then she was gone into the galaxy's interior. Crowley performed his pre-flight checks with the thoroughness of someone who respected both the aircraft and the impossibility of what he was attempting. Magda stood outside, watching, hands in her pockets, the coin warm against her fingers. The sun cleared the ridge. Her wheat blazed golden. The C-5's engines began their startup sequence, a rising whine that became a roar that became something elemental, louder than thought. Shepherd, Crowley's voice came through a handheld radio she didn't remember him giving her. 4,200 feet, no room for error. Then don't error, she replied, surprising herself with how naturally the radio cadence returned, that clipped efficiency of military communication. Wind 040 at 7 knots, temperature 58 degrees, density altitude favorable. You've got a tailwind component, but it's manageable. Copy all, departing on your center line. The galaxy began to roll, slowly at first, then accelerating with the inevitability of mass and thrust. Magda watched the numbers in her head: distance, velocity, lift coefficient, the margin between flight and catastrophe measured in feet and seconds. The nose lifted. The wings flexed. For a moment the aircraft hung suspended between earth and sky, neither fully committed to either, and then it was climbing, gear retracting, banking west toward mountains and whatever came next. The radio crackled. "Thanks, Shepard, for the runway, for everything." "Bring them home," she said. Always, then just static, and he was gone. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Not empty. Full of something Magda didn't have words for yet. She walked back to her farmhouse, the coin still in her palm, and looked at the foreclosure notice on her kitchen table. 6 days. But now there was money, Crowley's payment transferred to an account she hadn't checked, enough to clear the debt and more. Enough to keep the runway operational, the lights ready, the centerline painted. She made coffee and sat on her porch watching the contrail fade. The town would ask questions. Her brother would call it insanity. The VA therapist would talk about purpose and closure and moving forward. But Magda knew something they didn't. She knew that Shepard wasn't something she'd been. It was something she was: continuous, tense, ongoing. The mission hadn't ended. It had just evolved into something quieter, more patient. A runway maintained in the middle of nowhere for reasons that looked like stubbornness until they looked like salvation. 3 weeks later, another contrail appeared, this one at sunset, arcing in from the south. Different aircraft, smaller, but the approach was identical: too low, too deliberate, heading for N-47 with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what 4,200 feet meant. Magda was already walking the center line when it landed. A C-130, engines revering hard, stopping with 50 feet to spare. The loadmaster who emerged wore a flight suit with no insignia. "Shepard." "Who's asking?" "Firewatch. I flew relief missions in Haiti 2010. You coordinated supply drops when the airport was overwhelmed. Talked 17 aircraft down in 6 hours, prevented 3 collisions, probably saved hundreds of lives." She gestured back at the Hercules. "I've got medical supplies for a clinic in Alberta that officially doesn't exist. Needs a quiet stopover, refuel, and someone who understands the difference between legality and morality." Magda felt that old military awareness sharpen. Duration: 12 hours, dawn departure. Fuel requirements: already arranged. It'll be delivered by midnight. I just need the runway and someone who won't ask questions. Magda looked at the C-130, at the pilot who tracked her down, at her wheat moving in the wind. "The lights are always on," she said. Over the following months, N-47 became something else. Not officially, not on any chart or frequency or database, but among a certain community of pilots flying missions that existed in the margins between policy and principle, the word spread. Shepard maintained a runway in Montana. Shortest approach, highest risk, absolute reliability. The aircraft came irregularly, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes 2 in one night. C-17s and C-130s mostly, occasionally smaller craft, all flown by people who'd learned that official channels closed but human need remained. Magda coordinated fuel deliveries, perimeter security, rest cycles for exhausted crews. She learned to recognize the signatures of different aircraft on approach, the way they moved through her valley, the sounds their engines made under stress. She kept ledgers in her head: fuel costs, food expenses, maintenance for equipment that officially didn't exist. The money came from somewhere, unmarked transfers that covered expenses plus enough to keep the farm operational. She didn't ask. She knew the architecture of deniability. The town noticed, eventually. Hard not to when C-17s landed in your wheat field at midnight. Sheriff came by on a Tuesday, polite but curious, asking about noise complaints and unauthorized aviation activity. Magda showed him her grandfather's original Airstrip certification, her pilot's license, her logbooks showing regular maintenance flights. All true, all insufficient as explanations. But the sheriff was a veteran himself. Army, Iraq War. and he saw something in her records, in the way she held herself, that made him nod slowly and say he'd handle the noise complaints. Make sure people understood it was all legal and properly documented. "You're doing something," he said, not quite a question. "I'm maintaining an airstrip." "Yeah, I believe that's what you'd call it." He put his hat back on. "If you ever need anything, fuel, supplies, someone looking the other way at the right moment, you call me." "Why?" "Because some of us remember what it meant to make promises we couldn't keep through official channels. And some of us are grateful there are people who keep them anyway." He drove off, and Magda added his name to her mental list of people who understood the difference between rules and right action. Her brother visited in November, unannounced, driving up from Bozeman with concern etched into his face. He'd heard rumors. He'd seen bank records showing her accounts suddenly flush. He wanted explanations, wanted to understand why she was still here, still maintaining this God-forsaken strip of asphalt in the middle of nowhere. They sat on the porch, coffee between them, watching the sun set over mountains that would be snow-covered soon. "You're running some kind of smuggling operation," he said finally. "I'm keeping promises." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." Magda wrapped her hands around her mug. "I tried being a civilian, tried growing wheat and living quietly and pretending the years in uniform were just something I did once. But that's not how it works. Shepherd isn't a call sign I got. It's a description of who I am. People who bring others home. People who stay on frequency when everyone else signs off." That sounds like rationalization for breaking laws. Maybe, or maybe it's accepting that legality and morality don't always align, and when they don't, you choose the one that lets you sleep. She looked at him. "You want me to stop?" He was quiet for a long time. "I want you to be safe. I want you to have a life that isn't defined by what you did in Afghanistan. This is that life. It just looks different than you expected." She pointed at the runway. "That's not the past, it's the present. People still need help. The wars ended on paper but not in reality. So people like Crowley and Firewatch and 40 others whose real names I'll never know, they're still flying, still carrying people who fell through bureaucratic cracks, still doing the job because the alternative is leaving people behind. And they need runways. They need fuel. They need someone who maintains the lights. And that's you. That's me." He left without entirely understanding, but with acceptance if not approval. Magda watched his taillights disappear and felt no need to justify herself further. The work was its own explanation. The aircraft kept coming. Winter arrived hard and fast. Magda plowed the runway herself, a pre-dawn ritual when snow fell, clearing 4,200 feet of asphalt by hand and old tractor, making sure the center line stayed visible. The cold was brutal, wind cutting through layers, temperatures dropping to negatives that made metal brittle and fuel sluggish. But the aircraft still came. A C-130 on Christmas Eve, carrying a family of Syrian doctors who'd fled Damascus and were making their way to asylum in Toronto. A civilian cargo hauler on New Year's Day, retrofitted for passengers, bringing Afghan interpreters who'd waited 3 years for visas that never came through official processes. Each landing was harder in winter. Ice on the wings, reduced visibility, winds that gusted unpredictably through the valley. Magda stood on the runway in the dark, radio in hand, calling out conditions, wind shear warnings, temperature advisories. Her voice became something the pilots listened for, trusted, used to calibrate their approaches. "Shepherd's on frequency. Shepherd says it's good. Shepherd will get us down." The responsibility was enormous. Every landing she coordinated put lives in her hands. The pilots, the passengers, the entire web of people dependent on this impossible route staying operational. She felt the weight of it some nights, standing in her kitchen at 3 a.m., listening to the silence, wondering what would happen if she failed, if she called conditions wrong, if an aircraft crashed into her wheat field because she'd said yes when she should have said no. But then she'd think about the faces, the children sleeping in her barn, the elderly woman pressing a coin into her palm, the doctor who'd shaken her hand and said, "You saved my family." And she'd know that the weight was worth carrying, that some purposes found you rather than the other way around, that Shepard was simply who she was when stripped of everything else. February brought a different kind of visitor. 3 men in civilian clothes, federal agents though they didn't say so, asking about aircraft activity, unauthorized landings, violations of airspace regulations. They were polite but persistent, showing photos of her runway from satellite surveillance, asking pointed questions about fuel deliveries and maintenance schedules. Magda gave them coffee and her grandfather's original Airstrip documentation. It's legal, private use, agricultural designation. I maintain it for personal flying. You haven't filed a flight plan in 2 years. Don't need to for local flying, and I don't fly much anymore, just maintenance. But other aircraft land here, big ones, military cargo haulers. Occasionally someone has an emergency, needs a place to set down. I help when I can, that's not illegal. She met their eyes steadily. Is there a specific regulation I'm violating? They couldn't name one. The runway was legal, the landings technically fell under emergency provisions, and without evidence of smuggling or illegal cargo, they had nothing except suspicion. They left with warnings about cooperation with federal investigations and stern reminders about aviation law. Magda watched them go and immediately called a number Crowley had given her for emergencies. "They're getting curious," she said when he answered. "I know, we're adjusting routes, spreading things out. N47 needs to go quiet for a while. Maybe 3 months, maybe longer. Can you manage?" "The farm's fine, I can wait." "Good, Shepard, we've moved over 300 people in 8 months. Because of you. Because you kept the lights on. That's not small, that's everything." After the call ended, Magda walked her runway in the February cold, measuring distances by memory now, not needing the numbers anymore. 300 people, 38 flights, 0 accidents. That was the real metric. Not the wheat she grew or the land she owned, but the lives that had passed through this place on their way to safety. That was what 63 acres of Montana meant. That was what Shepard amounted to when you calculated it honestly. The quiet lasted 4 months. No aircraft, no midnight landings, just Magda and her wheat and the sky. She used the time to reinforce the runway, patching cracks, updating lights, installing better drainage. She also used it to remember what normal felt like: coffee on the porch, novels in the evening, phone calls with her brother that didn't involve defending her choices. It was pleasant. It was also incomplete, like waiting for a sentence to finish, for a mission to reach its conclusion. The aircraft returned in June, a C-17 at sunset, coming in low and fast with the confidence of a pilot who'd flown this approach before. Magda recognized the landing profile before she saw the markings. Crowley. He touched down perfectly, rolled to his usual stop, and emerged from the cockpit grinning. "Miss me?" Like a headache, but she was smiling. "What's the situation?" "Last run, final stop on this particular route. After this, the network shifts, finds new runways, new people. N47 gets retired from active use. You get your life back." He looked at her carefully. "That what you want?" Magda considered the question seriously. The farm was paid off. The wheat was growing. She had money, stability, the future everyone said she should want. But standing there on the asphalt with a C-17 at her back and the smell of jet fuel in the air, she felt more herself than she had in any quiet moment of the past 4 months. "What I want," she said slowly, "is to know people made it, that the promises got kept. The rest figures itself out." Crowley nodded. "Then let's finish this." The final passengers were 23 people, interpreters mostly, a few engineers, 2 families with children who'd been born in refugee camps and had never known stability. They emerged from the C-17 exhausted and hopeful in equal measure, carrying belongings in backpacks and plastic bags, wearing clothes that had crossed continents and looked it. Magda had prepared more thoroughly than usual. Food laid out in the barn, blankets, medical supplies, everything organized with military precision because this was the last time, the last chance to get it right. She moved among them offering water, answering questions in 3 languages pieced together from her service years, making sure children had snacks and parents had information. One interpreter, a young man who'd worked with Marines in Fallujah, recognized her somehow, the way she moved, the efficiency of her actions. "Your military," he said. "Was. But still," he gestured around, "this helping us, why?" Magda didn't have a simple answer. Because someone needs to, because promises matter even when the paperwork doesn't, because I'm good at maintaining runways. She paused. "What will you do after?" "Live, work, maybe go to school, regular things." His smile was tired but real. "Things I was promised 8 years ago when I started translating. Things I stopped believing were possible until your runway appeared on a flight plan." "It's just asphalt." "No, it's more. It's proof that some people remember." He touched his chest. "That some people are still shepherd." The phrase caught her, still shepherd. Not were or used to be, present tense. Ongoing, she nodded slowly, accepting the description as fact. They departed at dawn. Crowley ran his final checks while Magda coordinated fuel and conditions. The C-17 lifted off clean, banking north, disappearing into morning light. And then silence. The real kind this time, not the absence of something but the completion. Magda stood on her runway, radio quiet in her hand, watching the sky empty. Her phone buzzed. Text from a number she didn't recognize. Final count, 427 people moved safely. 0 incidents. Highest success rate of any route. Network leadership requests permission to designate N47 as memorial site. Shepherd's Run. Will never be used operationally again but will be honored. Your choice. Magda looked at her runway, her wheat, her grandfather's farmhouse. Memorial meant history, meant the mission was finished. It also meant recognition, meant the work mattered enough to be remembered even in the classified darkness where it would live forever. She typed back, "Accepted, but I'm keeping the lights on just in case." Because that was who she was. Shepherd. Present tense. Someone who kept runways operational and lights ready for aircraft that might never come but might need to. Someone who understood that service didn't end when the uniform came off. It just transformed into different shapes, different missions, the same underlying purpose. She walked back to her farmhouse as the sun climbed higher, warming the valley, making her wheat shine gold. Somewhere in 7 countries, people were waking up to the first day of lives they'd almost stopped believing were possible. They would never know her name, would never see N47 on any map, would never understand the network that had carried them to safety. But they would live. They would work. They would raise children who didn't know what it meant to run, who took safety for granted in the way only people who'd never lost it could. That was enough. That was everything. Shepherd's Run stayed operational, lights burning solar bright every night, a runway in Montana maintained by a woman who grew wheat and kept promises and refused to let call signs expire just because the missions changed shape. The sky stayed mostly empty, but mostly wasn't always. And when it wasn't, when some future pilot needed 4,200 feet of impossible landing in the middle of nowhere, the lights would be ready.